You are a part of God's story, this big epic adventure where He is in control and He has a plan. But for so many of us, we spend so much of our time focusing on the small details of the story, the trials, the heartaches, the problems. And because of that, we forget that God is really, really big and that He can use all of those small little details to further His big story. Join us today as we see how this plays out in the life of Jacob. All right, good morning. Welcome to our Genesis series. Glad you are joining us. Today we are on Genesis lesson 58. We're making our way through there. I'm going to start off with a story. It's kind of funny, but it makes a point. There was this workman who worked in a factory, and at the end of the day, he was pushing a wheelbarrow out of the factory, and inside the wheelbarrow, there was a very, very small box. So he was stopped by a security guard and he was asked, what do you have in the box? And he said, well, it's filled with sawdust. He said, you know how at the end of the day there's sawdust all over the floor? He said, well, I needed some, so I put some in a box and I'm taking it home with me. And the security guy was like, well, I don't know that I believe you, so open it up. So he opens it up, pours it out, it's all sawdust. So he's like, all right, go on through. So the next day, the same thing happened. What do you got? Sawdust. I'm just bringing sawdust. Empty it out. No problem. That's exactly what he did. Day 2, 3, 4, 5. Finally, on the 5th day after work, he's going out and the security guard is like, I know something's going on here. So he looks at the guy and he's like, tell me what is in your little box. And he goes, sawdust. I keep telling you this every single day. And he goes, look, the security guard goes, what's weird is that I know you're stealing something. I just don't know what it is. Like, I know something's going on here. He said, so if you tell me what it is you're doing, what it is you're stealing, he said, I'm not going to turn you in. I just really want to know. And so the man said, the workman looked at him, he said, all right, I'll tell you what I'm stealing. He goes, I'm stealing wheelbarrows. Okay, now the point to that is that it's so easy to get distracted with just the little things, the little box of sawdust without recognizing that there's a big wheelbarrow that's happening that no one's paying attention to because we're so focused on the little teeny tiny box. And I think we do that in life. We spend so much time worrying about, our trials and our heartaches and our troubles and our problems and we focus on that and we forget that there is a bigger picture involved. Last week at Bible study, there was a sweet woman. She came up to me, and this just reminded me of this. She hadn't been at Bible study for a couple weeks, and I said, oh my gosh, are you okay? And she said, I've been really, really sick, which is kind of like the sawdust in the little box. Problem, sickness, whatever. But then she went wheelbarrow on me, big picture. And she said this, she goes, sometimes God just wants to slow me down so I can spend more time with Him. And I thought, okay, that is so cute because that's the point. Sometimes we get so focused on I'm sick and poor me and wow that we forget. Maybe God just wants us to have some rest and some downtime and spend a little bit more time in His Word. I don't know. So here is where I want to go today. One thing I love about the Bible, and Genesis in particular, is this, that there's a story. There is. This big epic adventure that God has been directing since the beginning of time. And working through Genesis reminds me of how God works, and He works through people, and He works through circumstances, and He works through governments, and He works through so many different things. But He does it, why? To keep His story going. And no matter what we do, this is what we've been learning with Jacob, that even when we do dumb stuff, we've learned it with Noah and Abraham and all these Bible greats, that even when we do really dumb stuff, that we see this, that God is the greatest chess player of all time. He just is. Now, I've used this illustration before, probably in this series somewhere, I don't remember, but there was this oil painting in a museum that depicts this man. I'll put this picture up here so you can see it. The man's name is Faust, and he's engaged in a chess game with the devil. Faust was a man who gambled his life away with the devil over this stupid chess game. And it looks like he lost. In the picture, you can see his face. He just looks like he's in complete despair. He's been reduced to a few pawns, a knight, and a king. Now, from across the chessboard, you can see in the picture that the devil just leers at him, knowing that he won. Faust is out of moves. He's going to lose. So chess players from all around the world came to this gallery to actually study this board situation, this chessboard situation, and all agreed that the position Faust was in looked pretty hopeless. And they called the painting Checkmate, okay? But one day, a renowned chess master came to view this painting, and he pondered it as he kept looking at it and watching it. And suddenly, all the people in the gallery were startled when this chess master shouts and he says, "It's a lie! The king and the knight have one more move." And studying the life of Jacob, that's kind of how this feels sometimes. Because it feels like Jacob's life should have been checkmated over and over and over again, but God always has another move. We've seen it with Jacob's life's been kind of a disaster. But we see from him that God is the greatest chess player of all time. And that's really good news. And we need to know that as Christians, as followers of Jesus, because so many of us think that if something bad happened in your life, like all is lost. Some people think, I've done too many things bad, God would never forgive me. Some people think I've gone too far. The world has gone too far. For some people, it's I'm just too sick. There's no hope. How about the divorce is almost final. It's never gonna, be restored. God could not possibly fix what we've done. Nobody could save us now. I mean, that's kind of how we feel about God so often. But what we see from the Bible with stories like from Jacob is that that's actually not true at all. That we see in the life of Jacob, which is the same with us, the ups and downs of life, the bad things, the trials, the temptations, the sadness, the divorces, whatever it is, that God is still working. And we see with Jacob that God has been working behind the scenes all along. And that nothing Jacob could do would ever put him in checkmate. It just wouldn't. Now, this reminded me of a story I was reading. Skip Heidsieck, he's a pastor in Albuquerque. He tells a story about a time when he went to the Philippines, and it was a time of civil unrest there, and a group called the New People's Army, the NPA. They were a guerrilla armed group, and they were trying to come up against the legal government, take over, assume control, all of that. So they were traveling around, they were threatening people, they were going to churches, they were killing people, and they were trying to get everyone under their control. So when Skip Heidsieck shows up at this church, everyone's so excited because they have this great story to tell him. And they said this, they said, a few weeks ago, the NPA and 2 Jeeps pulled up outside the church. The guys got out with their guns. They walked into our church service in the middle of our Sunday service. They held up their guns and said, "We will be back next week. We want all the offerings of your church. If we don't get it, we're going to kill you." Now, all the people knew that they were very serious because they've done this before. And all the people were telling Skip, they said, the coolest thing was this. The following week, the church was full, okay? And I was laughing. I was like, could you imagine that in America? Everyone would be like, I'm too sick to go to church today. I'm sorry, I can't be there. Nope, not this church in the Philippines. They all came there. They were on their knees. They were praying. They were crying out to God. This was their heart. Like, God, save us from this. It was like a 2-hour service. By the time the 2 hours were over, no sign, no show of the NPA. And so what happened is they heard later in the day that those men were on their way to the church. But they were going down this windy road, and this freak accident happened, and it overturned the Jeeps, and it actually killed the men that were coming on their way to the church. And now, I say this, sad that it had to happen that way. God could have protected these people 1,000,001 different ways. But here's my point. God is that big. And we forget that sometimes, that he is so big, he's so much bigger than the story. We're just little pieces in the story. And he can move people around and do things. Like I said, he's the greatest chess player of all time. And what happens is when you and I can start understanding that God is that big, then God gets bigger. All of our problems in life pretty much get smaller. And that's a really good place to be. Skip was talking about, in relation to this story, he was talking about one day someone gave him a little remote control car. And so what he thought he would do would be to hide in the bushes, and then when someone on his staff would walk by, they couldn't see Skip in the bushes, but he would take this remote control car and charge at the person. And then they would jump out of the way, and then he'd turn the car around and then chase the staff member. And the staff member's looking around like, who is doing that? Like where is this coming from? And the problem was they couldn't see Skip was controlling the car. And there's something comforting to know that God is actually doing that for us. All right, he's behind the scenes, and he's doing the remote control thing. We don't see him, but he's always at work. And that's a really, really great reminder to all of us. I was talking to a friend one day, and she was telling me about this job. She just got a new job, a promotion in her job. But many, many years ago, she had a job that when her boss was going to retire, she knew she was next in line, and she was kind of a shoo-in for the job. But the guy above her and the other person that was leaving had her come in the office one day and said, we're not giving the job to you because we don't think you're a good enough leader. And she was devastated, clearly devastated. And she says, now that I look back, I see God's hand in it all. I didn't at the time. And she said now she's got I think it's with the same company, but she's went a different way, and she's got a bigger promotion, and now she's it's a really cool story. But she says, now I can see it clearly. Back then, I didn't. I was frustrated and confused. I just could not see what God was doing. But here's what we need to remember. When we don't see him, he's still at work. And that's really good news. Now, I want us to never forget that, because when things go not the way we want them to go in life, we need to remember God is always doing something behind the scene. Really put that on your refrigerator, okay? Remind yourself of that all the time. Because if we are followers of Jesus, we are part of this great, big adventure, his story, that starts in Genesis 1 and ends at the end of Revelation. And it's a beautiful story that you and I are actually a part of as his followers. Now, let's pick up the story from last week. God has been trying to get Jacob's attention. Jacob's been pretty hard-headed most of the time. He was heading back to the promised land, the land of Israel, where, here's a picture down by the Dead Sea. He stopped along the way at that little town called Shechem, put his family in danger. His daughter was raped. His sons went on a murderous rampage, killed all the men in the town. And Jacob finally says, enough is enough. We talked about that last week. He says, it's time for us to get our life back together. I need to get my relationship back with God. So he told his whole family and everyone with him, give me all your idols. We're getting rid of everything that goes against God. He buried him under a tree, and now they're on their way back to the land where he should have been. And they have this clean start. Now, here's what I want you to see, is that God was working behind the scene in the hearts of the people. Because Jacob's two sons just murdered all the men in the town of Shechem. That's a problem. Because if you think about it, all the surrounding cities could have heard about this, gotten together, and literally wiped out Jacob's family in a heartbeat. Okay, and they should have done that for what Jacob's sons did. But that didn't happen because God was working behind the scene in the hearts of the people. God had a plan for Jacob's life, just like he has a plan for you. And he works in the hearts of the people around us. Look at Genesis 35:5. They set out, they're leaving now Shechem, they're going back down to Bethel. And the terror of God fell upon the towns all around them so that no one pursued them. See, it's a reminder that God is really honestly that big. God turned the hearts of the people not to go after Jacob. Instead, the people in the surrounding cities were terrified of Jacob, especially after they heard what the sons had done. But the terror of God fell upon the towns instead of the towns were angry and wanted revenge on Jacob's people. It was flipped. But God did that. And the reason why we know that is because of Proverbs 21:1. The king's heart is like a stream of water directed by the Lord. He guides it wherever he pleases. I mean, really think about that. Your boss, your husband, your friend, your neighbor, your child, your parent, whatever, their heart is in the hand of God. And God directs it whichever way he needs it to go. I mean, that is how big our God is. And how that plays out in our life is this. God can turn your heart to love that person that you don't love at all. God can turn your heart to have compassion on that person that you have no compassion on. God can give you a love for your spouse. God can give you a love for your child. God can change someone's heart who wants nothing to do with Jesus and make sure that they become a follower of his. Because that and all of those things are God's specialty. Now, I want to share a story with you about, in regards to how God changes hearts, changes really hard-hearted people who want nothing to do with him. Because I want you to be encouraged that God is that big. I've been reading a lot of books lately about Christians in the Middle East, people where they live where populations are like 99% Muslims. And the stories of how these people came to know Jesus and how they live for him in this kind of an environment where, you could be killed if you had a Bible. You could be killed if they found out you were a follower of Jesus. We were reading a book called Women at Risk, and so that threw me onto a whole bunch of other books, and it's just grown my faith by leaps and bounds, because it's this reminder to me that how the Holy Spirit can change even the hardest heart. And these books have reminded me how God can turn the hearts of people just like he did to protect Jacob. I'm going to tell you a story. It's from a book called Standing in the Fire. Here's a picture of it. Tom Doyle wrote this. It's about two men who lived in Syria. Now, this is not what these two men look like, but I'm putting pictures so you can kind of get the two characters that I'm talking about. The first one, his name is Osama, not Bin Laden, okay? Osama is a name that, a lot of people have in the Middle East. Osama was a terrorist. He was like a freedom fighter. He wanted to fight against Bashar al-Assad regime. His goal was definitely to kill people. He wanted nothing to do with Christians, get rid of them all. That was who Osama was. But then there was his best friend and his cousin. His name was Jamal, okay? Now, Osama would have these meetings like to rile up the parties, so let's go kill them all, okay? But Jamal had a different thought process when he went to these meetings, because Jamal became a follower of Jesus. And he kept his faith really silent because he knew his family would be in a lot of danger. And he was waiting for the right time to actually talk to his cousin Osama about Jesus. So he sat down with him, and he just made one comment that just freaked out Osama. He was so angry. And so Jamal came home, and his wife said, "We need to move to another country." She's like, "This is ridiculous. He's going to kill us. You do know that." But Jamal said this. He said, "When Jesus came into my life, I knew he called me first to our precious family, yet my heart is in agony for my larger al-Jihadi family as well. Some people are called to take Jesus to foreign lands, but I'm to stay here. This is my calling. It begins for me in my house, but I am willing to tell everyone else about him too." His wife is like, "What is wrong with you? Your family are terrorists. They're going to begin noticing a change in you. The Holy Spirit has marked you. Please let someone else tell Osama about Jesus, not you." But Jamal said, when Osama becomes a believer, he will be like the modern day Apostle Paul. A few weeks later, a bomb hits Osama's house. He's taken to the hospital. He's very, very hurt. He went into surgery. He's in a coma now, so he's in the hospital. They don't know if he's going to live or die. So Jamal goes to Osama's room. And to Jamal's knowledge, Osama can't hear anything he's saying. But Jamal starts talking like this. He says, "Osama, I'm so sorry. I kick myself because I never told you this. Because I know you're in a coma, and we don't know if you're going to survive or not. So here goes." He says, "Osama, I began following Jesus last year. I found a Bible and I couldn't put it down. I don't even know where I got it. Initially, I wanted to find out where it had been corrupted. Every night in bed, I read under the covers by the light of my phone. I waited until my wife was asleep, and often I would not sleep myself, but that didn't matter. This Jesus was more than I could handle. Osama, Jesus loved people who were suffering, little children, the marginalized, the poor. He took time for people, even sinners. The worst ones were drawn to him, and he never turned them away. Did you know that Jesus caused a stir that news about him traveled all the way to Syria from Israel? See this loving Jesus? I had to come to grips with the depths of hate in my heart, and it was destroying me on the inside. Jesus said to love my enemies. That made no sense to me. So Osama, every day I'm going to come here and I'm going to read my Bible and pray for you. So just as he's saying this, this doctor walks in, and the doctor looks at him and was like, "Are you a believer?" And come to find out that the doctor is also a believer. And the doctor says this to him. He says, "Your cousin is one of the most feared men in the region." He said, "Do you not find it remarkable that God called you, his best friend, his cousin, to reach him? Who would listen to him other than, who would he listen to other than you? Like, who would he listen to?" And he asked, "Do you think he's open to anything about Jesus?" And Jamal said, "Probably not. It doesn't sound like it." The doctor said, "Well, if he makes it out alive, we're both going to tell him about Jesus because it's time to be bold in Syria." A couple weeks later, Osama wakes up. Jamal goes to see him, and Osama says this: "Thank you so much for coming as much as you did to visit me." Jamal's like, "Did your wife tell you I came here?" And he's like, "Oh no." He said, "I could hear you praying for me and reading to me." He said, "I have never heard prayers like that before." He said, "I want to know more." Jamal brings him a Bible and he starts reading, and he hides his Bible at the hospital underneath his pillow whenever someone comes in, and Osama gives his life to Jesus. It's so amazing how the Holy Spirit changes someone's heart and turns his heart to love him. Someone that's so, hateful and a terrorist, and yet God's like, "No, he's mine." It's like the Apostle Paul. So Osama gets out and he can't keep quiet about his faith. But when the rest of this terrorist group finds out about it, he gets in trouble. They beat him almost to death. They throw him in prison. And he faces a firing squad the next day. They're saying, "Recant your faith in Jesus. We won't kill you. Just tell us you don't believe in him." And But Osama refuses to do that. That night, the man who was his executioner, he stands outside of his cell. And Osama can't see him. He's around the corner, but he can hear him. And the executioner says, "Osama, I am very impressed with your faith." He said, "I am in charge of the firing squad tomorrow. Would you please just recant?" He said, "Tell him you returned to Islam. You don't have to mean it." He said, "But your life will be saved." Osama says this: "I won't deny my Savior who did not deny me." He said, "I will not deny him with my heart or my lips." So the executioner said this: "This is how it's going to go tomorrow." He said, "You're going to be picked up in a van and you're going to be taken to the execution site." He said, "They'll put a mask on you. They will put you in the death position, which is on your knees, hands behind you, like they always do." He said, "When you hear the first gunshot, it won't hit you. But," he said, "I want you to fall to the ground as if you've been hit." He said, "Don't move a muscle. Take shallow breaths so you are thought to be dead." He said, "When you hear us drive away, take off your mask. Walk a couple miles to the east. You will come to the Syrian army. Surrender to them. They will not kill you." Osama's like, "What?" He's like, "Who are you?" And with that, the executioner was gone. The next day, Osama did exactly what he was told, and he did not die. The first shot he heard, he fell over, pretended to be dead. He heard a few shots after that. He heard the van leave. He got up to see that the men who were sent to kill him, the executioner shot them instead of him. Because God had a plan for Osama. God is the greatest chess player in this world. Nothing could stop that plan. God turned the executioner's heart to save him and not kill him. Now, this executioner might have been a believer. At the point in the book, he's trying to find this man so he could talk to him. He hadn't been able to find him yet, but that's the point. This is the God that we serve. He is in charge of his story. God is the greatest chess player of all time. And how this played out in Jacob's life is that God turned the hearts of the men who should have killed Jacob and his family. And he turned their hearts to fear Jacob instead of kill him. And I believe that our faith will change dramatically when we see that God is that powerful and that personal to us. I don't want us ever to forget that we have a story, and our story is part of his story. And my hope and prayer for this Bible study is that we will all learn to love Jesus so much, just like Osama and Jamal, that we can be leading characters in his story. We want to be the heroes of this story, the women who stand up for our faith in Jesus, who tell others about him, and then watch them come to Jesus and then help them grow up in their faith. We don't want to be like an extra on a movie. You know, those extra that people are walking around the back. You never really see them. They're there, but they're not really doing anything. We don't want to be like that. We want to be leading characters in his story. So back to Jacob's story, God turned the hearts of the people not to kill him. Verse 6 says this, and all the people with him came to Luz, that is Bethel, in the land of Canaan. Finally, he's back home. Here's a map right here so you can see he went from Shechem. Now he's finally 30 miles away, gone to Bethel, where he's supposed to be. Verse 7 says this, there he built an altar and he called the place El Bethel because it was there that God revealed himself to him when he was fleeing from his brother. Jacob is back where he belongs, back at this place where God gave him this dream of the ladder going from heaven, where the angels were ascending and descending and God was at the top. Like, this is the same place in Jacob. It's probably been like 30 years. And now he's finally back to where he belongs. And he builds an altar because it's tangible. He wants people to really, truly, honestly see that he has come home to his faith and he's going to take this serious. He did something so people could see. For you, that might mean just your neighbors see you get up on Sunday mornings and you go to church. It could mean your kids call you and it goes to voicemail, and when you call them, you'd be like, hey, sorry, we were in church and man, it was a really good sermon today. You should come with me next week. It could mean your spouse wakes up in the morning and sees you reading your Bible and going to Bible study. It could mean that you work someplace and you keep your Bible on your desk so people can actually see, or you put a little, I can do all things through Christ, on your wall or something. So it's something tangible that people can see that you're serious about your faith. And for Jacob, he did that. He built an altar and he's finally home. It's this reminder that if you've walked away from your faith like we talked about last week, it's time to come home. It really is, because God is not done with you yet. He isn't. We just have to think about all that Jacob did that was so incredibly stupid. But God didn't pull his promise from Jacob. He never killed Jacob on the spot when he sinned. It's this great reminder that we can be forgiven for anything, what we did when we walked away from him. Here's my call, is to make today a day of new beginnings for you. But here's the deal, and this is where I want to go with the next portion of this lesson. You got to know this, because just because someone rededicates their life to God doesn't mean everything's going to go smoothly. And we see this with Jacob. He just rededicated his life. But when we do that, we assume that God's going to just, make everything happy for me and life's going to go good because I did a good thing by coming back to him. But we're going to see in this story with Jacob that we know life doesn't work that way. We have to remember that when bad things happen, as we will see in Jacob's life, we don't want to run away from God. We want to be the people that stand firm in our faith and knowing that God is still working even through all the tragedies. Now we're going to see this with Jacob because 3 people that he loves deeply are going to die. This is after he rededicates his life to God, and suddenly everyone's like dying around him. And one person will be devastating. Some of you that are watching this will get that. I mean, I'll hear from people and they'll be like, my parent died, my sibling died, my child died all in the last 2 years. And you're just like, what? Okay, you know the pain of that. And Jacob's getting ready to feel that. Genesis 35, verse 8. Now Deborah, Rebekah's nurse, died and was buried under the oak below Bethel. So it was named Al-Bakuth. Who's Deborah? We have to go all the way back to Abraham, when Abraham sends a servant 400 miles north to Haran to find a wife for his son Isaac. And 400 miles away, Rebekah comes back to marry Isaac. Rebekah is Jacob's mom, okay? But along when Rebekah came back, who also came back with her were some maids. So it sounds like Deborah was probably her maid way, way back then. Maybe she was Jacob's nanny. Maybe she was Jacob's nurse. Like, we don't know, but now she was living with Jacob, and we don't know why that was. The Bible doesn't say that, but at some point, she started traveling with Jacob. I mean, Jacob's got all these kids, for crying out loud. He's going to need someone to help him, so maybe that's what she did. And now she dies. She had to have been a beloved part of this family for her to get a piece of the Bible. Verse 9 says this: After Jacob returned from Padan Aram, God appeared to him again and blessed him. And God said, "Your name is Jacob, but you will no longer be called Jacob. Your name will be Israel." So he named him Israel. Now it's interesting. Deborah dies, and God comes to him and reminds him something that he already told him. Remember the wrestling match that he had with God? And God's like, "I've changed your name to Israel." But the problem was, Jacob never acted like Israel. He never acted like that God had given him this new name and this new purpose. And this was just a reminder that probably Jacob needed as he was coming back into town, as bad things started happening. He needed to remember that God still loved him, and then God still had a plan for his life. Verse 11 says this: "And God said to him, I am God Almighty. Be fruitful and increase in number. A nation and a community of nations will come from you, and kings will come from your body. The land I gave to Abraham and Isaac, I also give to you, and I will give this land to your descendants afterwards." In other words, I know you screwed up your life, Jacob. I know your family is a disaster. I know your relationships have been a disaster. But I'm going to keep my promise, Mr. Israel. Doesn't even want to call him Jacob anymore. And I bet that was so encouraging to Jacob. Verse 13, "Then God went up from him at a place where he had talked with him. Jacob set up a stone pillar at the place where God had talked with him, and he poured out a drink offering on it, and he also poured oil on it. Jacob called the place where God had talked with him Bethel." And then in verse 16, we see something. Then they moved on from Bethel. Now, I don't know why. It doesn't say why he moved on, because Bethel was such an important place for his faith. But we have to remember that his dad, Isaac, is still alive. And they had a very, very strained relationship, way back from 30 years ago. Remember, Jacob deceived his father, lied, and said he was his brother. There was this whole disaster. And he had to get out of town because, his brother Esau would kill him. So he deceived his father. And Jacob probably needed to make things right with him. And at this point, Isaac didn't know anyone. He didn't know Jacob's wives or his kids, which would be Isaac's grandchildren. So I bet Jacob wanted to get back down farther too. He's probably in Beersheba. And so I think it's a good move. But along the way, something really sad happens. Look in verse 16. "Then they moved on from Bethel. While they were still some distance from Ephrath," it'd be nice if I could say that right, Rachel began to give birth and had great difficulty. Now remember, this is Rachel, the love of his life, the one he fell in love with originally. He didn't love Leah. He didn't love the maids. Those were just thrown on him, all right, because God was using it to build a nation. But the only person he really ever loved was Rachel. Now, Ephrath is actually our modern day Bethlehem. So you can see this picture up here. He comes all the way from Haran at the top. He comes down, he comes down Penuel, and then he goes left to Succoth, and then left to Shechem. So that's where he's been. Now he's down to Bethel, and he's going down to Hebron. His dad must have been in Hebron instead of Beersheba. And you see he passes by Bethlehem. And now Rachel is pregnant with her second child, and she's having problems. Verse 17, "She was having a great difficulty in childbirth. The midwife said to her, 'Don't be afraid, for you have another son.' As she breathed her last, for she was dying, she named her son Ben-Ani, but his father named him Benjamin. So Rachel died and was buried on the way to Ephrath, that is Bethlehem. Over her tomb, Jacob set up a pillar, and to this day the pillar marks Rachel's tomb." You can actually go to Israel near Bethlehem, and there is a place called Rachel's tomb where they've enclosed it so you can actually see it. But here was the deal with Jacob. He devoted his life back to God, and his beloved Rachel was gone. Rachel now has 2 sons. He's probably really wishing Deborah was still alive at this point. But he has 2 sons now, Joseph and Benjamin. Now, I'm assuming that Leah is still alive. She's probably like super like, yay, now I get Jacob all to myself, okay? Finally, he's going to love me because my sister's out of the picture. But it's interesting that Leah was probably his wife for some time. And we learn in Genesis 49 that Jacob will eventually bury Leah when she dies. But Leah is the one that's buried alongside Abraham and Sarah and Isaac and Rebekah. It's not Rachel. It's Leah. And it's interesting that the love of his life is buried along the road someplace, and yet Leah is the one that gets the honor with this tomb near Abraham and Sarah. Verse 21 says this: Israel, or Jacob, moved on again and pitched his tent beyond Migdal Eder. Now this is probably near Bethlehem. But then something weird happens. And we can only speculate why, because right in the middle of this story about the sadness of Rachel, then this happens. Look at verse 22. While Israel was living in that region, Reuben went in and slept with his father's concubine, Bilhah. You're like, what? All right, so let's put up our little family dysfunctional tree again, okay? And you see here that Leah is the one, remember, he loves Rachel. Rachel had, Joseph and Benjamin. It's the love of his life. Jacob was tricked into marrying Leah, but he still honored that marriage. And she had Reuben, Simeon, Levi. Reuben is who we're talking about now. Simeon and Levi are the 2 that went on the murderous rampage. So Reuben, all 3 of these are just disaster of children at this point. But what happened is, if you look over there at the top, it'll say Bilhah. So Bilhah was Rachel's maid. And so Jacob and Leah's oldest son, Reuben, goes and sleeps with Bilhah, the maid. Okay, that's a bad deal. Now, that's messed up, but maybe the reason why is to prove a couple things. Maybe he was like, I just want to prove to you that I'm the oldest and I'm next in line after daddy dies, okay? He wants to maybe show people that he has the firstborn rights. Maybe Jacob was falling apart because Rachel died. Maybe Reuben knew that Jacob never really loved his mom Leah. So now with Rachel being gone, maybe Jacob was going to love Bilhah, the maid, more than his mom. Like we just don't know what was going on in his life. So maybe by having sex, sleeping with Bilhah, it took her out of the running for Jacob to love her more than his mom. So there's just a lot of things. If he slept with Bilhah, it would put her in the living widowhood stage. And then that way Jacob wouldn't go into her. Like, we don't know. There was just crazy madness back then. But what we do see this a lot in the Bible, when someone is trying to make a political move, and this could be what Reuben was doing. We saw it with Solomon's older brother. After David died, Solomon's older brother wanted one of these women. And Solomon killed him for it because his brother was trying to politically take over the throne. We see it with Absalom, David's sons. He went in as a political move and slept with all of his father's concubines. So if this were Reuben's plan, here's the deal, it didn't work. In fact, all 3 of those boys were disqualified, really spiritually. And we see this in Genesis 49. When Jacob was on his deathbed, we'll get there eventually, but I'll kind of show you what's going on, because this is kind of amazing. Genesis 49 says this about these 3 boys. Then Jacob called for his sons and said, "Gather around me so I can tell you what will happen to you in the days to come. Assemble and listen, sons of Jacob. Listen to your father Israel." And then he talks about Reuben, the one who just slept with the maid. "You are my firstborn, my might, the first sign of my strength, excelling in honor, excelling in power. Turbulent as the waters, you will no longer excel. For you went up onto your father's bed, onto my couch, and defiled it." He's saying, sorry, you're out. All right. You can see this picture here again with the family tree, and there's Reuben's out. He goes on in verse 5 to talk about Simeon and Levi. Simeon and Levi, they're the next 2, are brothers. Their swords are weapons of violence. Let me not enter their council. Let me not join their assembly, for they have killed men in their anger and hamstrung oxen as they pleased. Cursed be their anger, so fierce, and their fury so cruel. I will scatter them in Jacob and disperse them in Israel. In other words, you will be nothing in this land. And then he goes on, if you look at the Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and then there's Judah. Now, look at Judah. We'll see Judah later, but at this particular point, there'll be a reason for Judah. Look at verse 8. Judah, your brothers will praise you. Your hands will be on the neck of your enemies. Your father's sons will bow down to you. And this is why, look at this. The scepter will not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until he comes to him who belongs, and the obedience of the nation is his. And what's the greatest part about Judah is that Judah is the lineage where Jesus himself will come from. Look at Revelation 5, verse 5. There's this great scene in heaven where Jesus is, needs to open this scroll, and but look at what it says in verse 5. Then one of the elders said to me, "Do not weep. See, the Lion, Jesus, of the tribe of who? Judah. The root of David has triumphed. He is able to open the seal and scroll, the scroll and the seven seals." So we see that Judah, all the way back in Genesis, his lineage comes Jesus. The first three lose their spiritual inheritance. Let's go on to Genesis 35:22. While Israel, Jacob, was living in the region, Reuben went in and slept with his father's concubine Bilhah, and Israel heard of it. And then he starts in with this whole genealogy, all right? He says, Reuben's the firstborn of Jacob, and he goes through who, all the different wives and who the kids are and all of that. And then verse 27 says this. Jacob came home to his father Isaac in Mamre near Kiriath Arba, that is Hebron, where Abraham and Isaac had stayed. Isaac lived 180 years, and then he breathed his last and died. So this is a third person that is going to die, on Jacob's watch here. He died old and full of years, and his sons Esau and Jacob buried him. And I thought that's interesting that we see Esau and Jacob back together burying their father. So what this chapter kind of reminds me of is this, that life goes on. Generations come and go, people come and go, some go early, some go late, who knows? Deborah died in her old age. Rachel died in her young age. Isaac died in his way, way old age, okay? And yet I look at their lives and I think of one word, and it's legacy. When I think of Deborah, I think her legacy is loyal, devoted, persevered, never gave up, hung in there until the very end with this family doing her job. That's a great legacy. But then I think of Rachel. I don't like her legacy. Rachel couldn't get pregnant. She hated her sister. She was jealous. She was conniving. She told Jacob, "Give me a child or I will die." She never knew that a child would actually be what would kill her. When I think of Rachel, I don't see a legacy of a love for God. I see a legacy of a love for herself. When I think of Rachel, I think of commotion. I don't think that's a great legacy. And then there's Isaac, who died. Isaac is, his legacy is he was Abraham's loner son. He was the son of this promise, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. He has two sons. It's kind of dysfunctional. He loves the godless one and doesn't like the one that God wants to use. So you see this whole, he's got favoritism, and I think he destroyed these two boys' relationship because of it. I think Isaac was kind of a hypochondriac. I think he didn't love God with all of his heart. And I kind of feel like his legacy was kind of a disaster too. But it's made me start thinking, what will my legacy or your legacy be? I thought this was funny. The Smiths were a proud family of their tradition. Their ancestors had come to America on the Mayflower. They had their lineage included senators and pastors and Wall Street wizards. So they decided to compile a family history, a legacy for their children. So they hired a well-known author. But only one problem is that they had a great Uncle George who was really a bad guy and ended up being executed in the electric chair because he was so bad. But the author said, "Don't worry, I'll handle it well. I won't put a bad light on your family." So when the book came out, the family turned to the section on Uncle George, and this is what they said. George Smith occupied a chair of applied electronics at an important government institution. He was attached to his position by the strongest of ties, and his death came as a real shock. You're like, what? But I guess you can make your legacy say anything you want if you just say the right wording. But speaking of legacy, there was a pastor's name was Vic Folkert, and he said this. He said that he once served this country church that had this bell tower, okay? The problem was that the bell tower always leaked, and they needed to tear it down. But there was one church member, his name was Henry, and he was the wealthiest, most powerful man in the church. And because of that, he got whatever he wanted. He was obstinate, he was mean, and he threatened, if you don't keep that tower, he goes, I'm not going to contribute to this building campaign. But after several decades, Henry died, and the church board decided to tear down the bell tower. And along with it, part of Henry's legacy came down also. But this pastor, Vic, he says this. He said, when I think about Henry and the bell tower, it's almost like a parable for me. He said the irony of the whole thing was that the largest contributions towards the removal of the bell tower were from Henry's descendants, his kids and his grandkids. He said his grandkids are generous men of God. And they weren't like his father, where it was like they held his money over the pastor's head, or they're not mean or they're not angry. And here's the cool part is that they rose above the legacy of their natural family to embrace the legacy of Jesus. And what they're doing is they're passing the legacy of Jesus, not their father or grandfather, down to their kids. And so it's just a reminder to us that just because of how our parents acted, or your parents or grandparents or whoever they are, we don't have to act like them. We need to make our own legacy. And our own legacy needs to be following Jesus and passing that on to our kids. So I want to move on to chapter 36 real quick, because I want to get to Joseph finally next week. But we got to get Esau off the pages of the Bible. In Genesis 36 is the final chapter. Esau's we won't see him anymore. And what we're going to see is why our spiritual legacy matters. Because Esau did not have a spiritual legacy. Esau had land and he had wealth, and he was the father of a nation, the Edomites. He had a lot of kids, he had a lot of wives. He had the lineage of kings and chiefs. But Esau never loved God, nor did he point his family to the one true God. Esau's faith in God should have mattered. His grandfather was Abraham. His father was Isaac. He should have followed the path of God, but he didn't. He chose the me path, not the God path. He chose the no one's going to tell me what to do path. And in the end, he had built a nation. But here's what we learn. You can build something for yourself in this life that might not matter for eternity at all. And that would be Esau's legacy. Now, I'm going to put all these verses in the handout. We're not going to go over them, or we're not going to read them, because really it's just Genesis 36 is an account of Esau's life. And all it is just Esau took wives from here, and this is what happened, and this person begot this person, and this person, blah, 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 all the way through. And so you can read that on your own, and it probably will put you to sleep, but this is just the ending to Esau's life. I'll go to the very, very last verse, verse 43. Magdiel and Aram, they were the chiefs of Edom according to their settlements in the land they occupied. This was Esau, the father of the Edomites. He built a nation, but the nation never lasted. In fact, this particular nation, were arch enemies of Israel. And one of the descendants that came from Esau's line was, guess who? Herod the Great. The one who wanted to kill Jesus, who tried to kill infant Jesus in Bethlehem. In AD 70, the Esau's descendants, they were called the Idumeans. They joined the Israelites in their revolt against Rome, and they were wiped out when Jerusalem was destroyed. And descendants of Esau disappeared from human history. And that's what happened to his legacy. So, we'll see at the very, when Jesus comes back, it's this restored Israel that one day will possess this land of Edom. It'll be during the millennial reign of Christ. But here's the bottom line, is that Jesus wins. And we want to be on the right side of this. We want a legacy that matters. What we need to remember is that our faith in Jesus matters, and our legacy of faith matters. Because as we can see from Isaac and Deborah and Rachel, is that this life is really, really short compared to all eternity. And we need to decide who we're going to live for. Are we going to live for Jesus? Or are we going to live for me and my life and whatever I want to do? Because the Bible tells us and reminds us that there is a story. And Jacob is a huge part of this epic adventure. Because in the end, the lineage of Jacob would have an eternal blessing, because through his line would come Jesus himself. The one who came to this earth and died on a cross to pay the penalty for our sin, so we could have a restored relationship with God, where we can spend all eternity in heaven with him. And we as followers of Jesus get the privilege, like Osama, like Jamal, to tell others of this grand story that Jesus came so that we could have a relationship with God and spend eternity with him. So, here's what you need to remember. That we need to pass our legacy down and make our legacy all about Jesus. Because this story of Esau and Jacob, before we get to Joseph next week, is such a clear reminder that you can build something for yourself in this life that might not matter for eternity. I hope this helped you today. Super excited for next week when we finally get to the story about Joseph. So, see you then.